The actors, by their presence, always convince me, to my horror, that most of what I've written about them until now is false. It is false because I write about them with steadfast love. Even now, while I write it down, this too becomes false. But varying ability, and this varying ability does not hit off the real actors loudly and correctly, but loses itself dully in this love that will never be satisfied with the ability, and therefore thinks it is protecting the actors by preventing this ability from exercising itself. It is, to describe it figuratively, as if an author were to make a slip of the pen, and as if this clerical error became conscious of being such. Perhaps this was no error, but in a far higher sense was an essential part of the whole exposition. It is, then, as if this clerical error were to revolt against the author, out of hatred for him, were to forbid him to correct it, and were to say, "No, I will not be erased. I will stand as a witness against thee, that thou art a very poor writer." At times, frankly, I find it pretty slim pickings. But at the age of 40, I look on my old fair-weather friend, the general reader, as my last deeply contemporary confidant. And I was rather strenuously requested, long before I was out of my teens, by at once the most exciting and the least fundamentally bumptious public craftsman I've ever personally known, to try to keep a steady and sober regard for the amenities of such a relationship, be it ever so peculiar or terrible. In my case, he saw it coming on from the first. The question is, how can a writer observe the amenities if he has no idea what his general reader is like? The reverse is common enough, most certainly, but just when has the author of a story ever asked what he thinks the reader is like? Very luckily, to push on and make my point here, and I don't think it's the kind of point that will survive an interminable build-up, I found out a good many years back practically all I need to know about my general reader, that is to say you, I'm afraid. You'll deny it up and down, I fear, but I'm really in no position to take your word for it. You're a great bird lover. Much like a man in a short story called Skule Scary by John Buchan, which Arnold L. Sugarman Jr. once pressed me to read during a very poorly supervised study hall period. You're someone who took up birds in the first place because they fired your imagination. They fascinated you because, quote, they seemed of all created beings the nearest to pure spirit. Those little creatures with a normal temperature of 125 degrees, end of quote. Probably just like this John Buchan man, you thought many thrilling related thoughts. You reminded yourself, I don't doubt, that, quote, the gold crest, with a stomach no bigger than a bean, flies across the North Sea. The curlew sandpiper, which breeds so far north that only about 3 people have ever seen its nest, goes to Tasmania for its holidays, end of quote. It would be too much of a good thing to hope, of course, that my very own general reader should turn out to be one of the 3 people who have actually seen the curlew sandpiper's nest. But I feel at least that I know him, you, quite well enough to guess what kind of well-meant gesture might be welcomed from me right now. In this entre nous spirit, then, old confidant, before we join the others, the grounded everywhere, including, I'm sure, the middle-aged hot rodders who insist on zooming us to the moon, the Dharma bums, the makers of cigarette filters for thinking men, the beat and the sloppy and the petulant, the chosen cultists, all the lofty experts who know so well what we should or shouldn't do with our poor little sex organs, all the bearded, proud, unlettered young men and unskilled guitarists and Zen killers and incorporated aesthetic teddy boys who look down their thoroughly unenlightened noses at this splendid planet where, please don't shut me up, Kilroy, Christ, and Shakespeare all stopped before we join these others. I privately say to you, old friend, unto you, really, I'm afraid, please accept from me this unpretentious bouquet of very early blooming parentheses. I suppose, most unflorally, I truly mean them to be taken first off as bow-legged, buckle-legged omens of my state of mind and body at this writing, professionally speaking, which is the only way I've ever really enjoyed speaking up, and just to ingratiate myself still less, I speak 9 languages incessantly, 4 of them stone dead. Professionally speaking, I repeat, I'm an ecstatically happy man. I've never been before. Oh, once, perhaps, when I was 14 and wrote a story in which all the characters had Heidelberg dueling scars. The hero, the villain, the heroine, her old nanny, all the horses and dogs. I was reasonably happy then, you might say, but not ecstatically, not like this. To the point, I happen to know possibly none better than an ecstatically happy writing person is often a totally draining type to have around. Of course, the poets in this state are by far the most, quote, difficult, end of quote. But even the prose writer, similarly seized, hasn't any real choice of behavior in decent company, divine or not. A seizure's a seizure. And while I think an ecstatically happy prose writer can do many good things on the printed page, the best things, I'm frankly hoping it's also true and infinitely more self-evident, I suspect, that he can't be moderate or temperate or brief. He loses very nearly all his short paragraphs. He can't be detached, or only very rarely and suspiciously on down waves. In the wake of anything as large and consuming as happiness, he necessarily forfeits the much smaller, but for a writer always rather exquisite pleasure of appearing on the page, serenely sitting on a fence. Worst of all, I think he's no longer in a position to look after the reader's most immediate want, namely, to see the author get the hell on with his story. Hence, in part, that ominous offering of parentheses a few sentences back. I'm aware that a good many perfectly intelligent people can't stand parenthetical comments while a story is purportedly being told. We're advised of these things by mail, mostly granted by thesis preparers with very natural OD urges to write us under the table in their off-campus time. But we read, and usually we believe, good, bad, or indifferent, any string of English words holds our attention as if it came from Prospero himself. I'm here to advise that not only will my asides run rampant from this point on, I'm not sure, in fact, that there won't be a footnote or two, but I fully intend from time to time to jump up personally on the reader's back when I see something off the beaten plot line that looks exciting or interesting and worth steering toward. Speed, here, God save my American hide, means nothing whatever to me. There are, however, readers who seriously require only the most restrained, most classical, and possibly deftest methods of having their attention drawn. And I suggest, as honestly as a writer can suggest this sort of thing, that they leave now, while I can imagine the leaving's good and easy. I'll probably continue to point out available exits as we move along, but I'm not sure I'll pretend to put my heart into it again. I'd like to start out with some rather unstinting words about those 2 opening quotations. Quote, the actors by their presence, end of quote, is from Kafka. The second one, quote, it is, to describe it figuratively as if an author were to make a slip of the pen, end of quote, is from Kierkegaard. And it's all I can do to keep from unattractively rubbing my hands together at the thought that this particular Kierkegaard passage may catch a few existentialists and somewhat overpublished French mandarins with their by some little surprise. This modest aspersion is thoroughly reprehensible, but the fact that the great Kierkegaard was never a Kierkegaardian, let alone an existentialist, cheers one bush league intellectual's heart no end, never fails to reaffirm his faith in a cosmic poetic justice, if not a cosmic Santa Claus. I don't really deeply feel that anyone needs an airtight reason for quoting from the works of writers he loves, but it's always nice, I'll grant you, if he has one. In this case, it seems to me that those two passages, especially in contiguity, are wonderfully representative of the best, in a sense, not only of Kafka and Kierkegaard, but of all the four dead men, the four variously notorious sick men or underadjusted bachelors. Probably only Van Gogh, of the four, will be excused from making a guest appearance in these pages, whom I most often run to, occasionally in real distress, when I want any perfectly credible information about modern artistic processes. By and large, I've reproduced the two passages to try to suggest very plainly how I think I stand in regard to the overall mass of data I hope to assemble here, a thing that in some quarters, I don't a bit mind saying, an author can't be too explicit about or any too early. In part, though, it would be rewarding for me to think, to dream, that those two short quotations may quite conceivably serve as a sort of spot convenience to the comparatively new breed of literary critics, the many workers, soldiers, I suppose you could say, who put in long hours, often with waning hopes of distinction in our busy neo-Freudian arts and letters clinics, especially perhaps those still very young students and greener clinicians, themselves implicitly bursting with good mental health, themselves, undeniably, I think, free of any inherent morbid trait to beauty, who one day intend to specialize in aesthetic pathology. Admittedly, this is a subject I've felt flinty about since I was 11 years old and watched the artist and sick man I've loved most in this world, then still in knee pants, being examined by a reputable group of professional Freudians for 6 hours and 45 minutes. In my not altogether reliable opinion, they stopped just short of taking a brain smear from him, and I've had an idea for years that only the late-ish hour, 2 a.m., dissuaded them from doing exactly that. Flinty, then, I do indeed mean to sound here. Churlish, no. I can perceive, though, that it's a very thin line, or plank, but I'd like to try to walk it for a minute more. Ready or not, I've waited a good many years to collect these sentiments and get them off. A great variety of rumors, of course, run high and wide about the extraordinarily, the sensationally creative artists, and I'm alluding exclusively here to painters and poets in full Dichter. One of these rumors, and by far to me the most exhilarating of the lot, is that he has never, even in the pre-psychoanalytical dark ages, deeply venerated his professional critics, and has in fact usually lumped them, in his generally unsound views of society, with the echt publishers and art dealers and the other, perhaps enviably prosperous camp followers of the arts who, he's just scarcely said to concede, would prefer different, possibly cleaner work if they could get it. But what, at least in modern times, I think one most recurrently hears about the curiously productive, though ailing poet or painter, is that he is invariably a kind of supersized, but unmistakably classical neurotic, an aberrant who only occasionally, and never deeply, wishes to surrender his aberration, or, in English, a sick man who not at all seldom, though he's reported to childishly deny it, gives out terrible cries of pain as if he would wholeheartedly let go both his art and his soul to experience what passes in other people for wellness. And yet, the rumor continues, when his unsalutary-looking little room is broken into and someone, not infrequently at that, someone who actually loves him, passionately asks him where the pain is, he either declines or seems unable to discuss it at any constructive clinical length. And in the morning, when even great poets and painters presumably feel a bit more chipper than usual, he looks more perversely determined than ever to see his sickness run its course, as though by the light of another, presumably working day, he had remembered that all men, the healthy ones included, eventually die, and usually with a certain amount of bad grace, but that he, lucky man, is at least being done in by the most stimulating companion, disease or no, he has ever known. On the whole, treacherous as it may sound coming from me with just such a dead artist in the immediate family as I've been alluding to throughout this near polemic, I don't see how one can rationally deduce that this last general rumor and mouthful isn't based on a fairish amount of substantial facts. While my distinguished relative lived, I watched him, almost literally I sometimes think, like a hawk. By every logical definition, he was an unhealthy specimen. He did, on his worst nights and late afternoons, give out not only cries of pain, but cries for help. And when nominal help arrived, he did decline to say in perfectly intelligible language where it hurt. Even so, I do openly cavil with the declared experts in these matters, the scholars, the biographers, and especially the current ruling intellectual aristocracy educated in one or another of the big public psychoanalytical schools. And I cavil with them most acrimoniously over this. They don't listen properly to cries of pain when they come. They can't, of course. They're a peerage of 10 ears. They're a peerage of 10 ears. With such faulty equipment, with those ears, how can anyone possibly trace the pain? By sound and quality alone, back to its source? With such wretched hearing equipment, the best I think that can be detected and perhaps verified is a few stray, thin overtones, hardly even counterpoint, coming from a troubled childhood or a disordered libido. But where does by far the bulk, the whole ambulance load of pain really come from? Where must it come from? Isn't the true poet or painter a seer? Isn't he actually the only seer we have on earth? Most apparently not the scientist, most emphatically not the psychiatrist. Surely the one and only great poet the psychoanalysts have had was Freud himself. He had a little ear trouble of his own, no doubt, but who in his right mind could deny that an epic poet was at work? Forgive me. I'm nearly finished with this. In a seer, what part of the human anatomy would necessarily be required to take the most abuse? The eyes, certainly. Please, dear general reader, as a last indulgence if you're still here, reread those 2 short passages from Kafka and Kierkegaard I started out with. Isn't it clear? Don't those cries come straight from the eyes? However contradictory the coroner's report, whether he pronounces consumption or loneliness or suicide to be the cause of death, isn't it plain how the true artist, seer, actually dies? I say, and everything that follows in these pages all too possibly stands or falls on my being at least nearly right. I say that the true artist, seer, the heavenly fool, who can and does produce beauty, is mainly dazzled to death by his own scruples, the blinding shapes and colors of his own sacred human conscience. My credo is stated. I sit back, I sigh, happily, I'm afraid. I light a murad and go on, I hope to God, to other things. Something now, and briskly if I can, about that subtitle, quote, an introduction, end of quote. Up near the top of the marquee, my central character here, at least in those lucid intervals when I can prevail upon myself to sit down and be reasonably quiet, will be my late eldest brother, Seymour Glass, who, and I think I'd prefer to say this in one obituary-like sentence, in 1948, at the age of 31, while vacationing down in Florida with his wife, committed suicide. He was a great many things to a great many people while he lived, and virtually all things to his brothers and sisters and our somewhat outsized family. Surely he was all real things to us, our blue-striped unicorn, our double-lensed burning glass, our consultant genius, our portable conscience, our supercargo, and our one full poet. And inevitably, I think, since not only was reticence never his strongest suit, but he spent nearly 7 years of his childhood as star turn on a children's coast-to-coast radio quiz program, so there wasn't much that didn't eventually get aired, one way or another. Inevitably, I think, he was also our rather notorious, quote, mystic, end quote, unbalanced type, end of quote. And since I'm obviously going whole hog right here at the outset, I'll further enunciate, if one can enunciate and shout at the same time, that with or without a suicide plot in his head, he was the only person I've ever habitually consorted with, banged around with, who more frequently than not tallied with the classical conception, as I saw it, of a mukta, a ring-ding enlightened man, a god-knower. At any rate, his character lends itself to no legitimate sort of narrative compactness that I know of, and I can't conceive of anyone, least of all myself, trying to write him off in one shot or in one fairly simple series of sittings, whether arranged by the month or the year. I come to the point. My original plans for this general space were to write a short story about Seymour and to call it, quote, Seymour 1, end of quote, with the big, quote, 1, end of quote, serving as a built-in convenience to me, buddy glass, even more than to the reader, a helpful, flashy reminder that other stories, a Seymour 2, 3, and possibly 4, would logically have to follow. Those plans no longer exist, or if they do, and I suspect that this is much more likely how things stand, they've gone underground with an understanding, perhaps, that I'll rap 3 times when I'm ready. But on this occasion, I'm anything but a short story writer where my brother is concerned. What I am, I think, is a thesaurus of undetached prefatory remarks about him. I believe I essentially remain what I've almost always been, a narrator, but one with extremely pressing personal needs. I want to introduce, I want to describe, I want to distribute mementos, amulets. I want to break out my wallet and pass around snapshots. I want to follow my nose. In this mood, I don't dare go anywhere near the short story form. It eats up fat little undetached writers like me whole. But I have many, many unfelicitous sounding things to tell you. For instance, I'm saying cataloging. So much so early about my brother, I feel you must have noticed. You may also have noticed, I know it hasn't entirely escaped my attention, that everything I've so far said about Seymour and about his blood type in general, as it were, has been graphically panegyric. It gives me pause, all right. Granted that I haven't come to bury, but to exhume and, most likely, to praise. I nonetheless suspect that the honor of cool, dispassionate narrators everywhere is remotely at stake here. Had Seymour no grievous faults, no vices, no meanness that can be listed, at least in a hurry? What was he, anyway? A saint?